They called me just an employee. In front of 200 wedding guests, my father humiliated me with a speech. But 2 minutes later, my 80-year-old grandfather stood up and gave me the company worth over $1 million. My name's Ethan Carter. I'm 31, an architect living in Houston, and I used to be invisible in my own family. I always felt like a shadow in my own family. Growing up in Houston, Texas, surrounded by mansions and manicured lawns, our house stood taller than most. Yet inside those walls, I was invisible. I was the quiet one, the observer. My mother passed away when I was 10. Cancer. She was soft-spoken, an artist, someone who saw things in colors while my father only saw numbers. Her absence created a void that was quickly filled by Margaret, my father's second wife, and soon after by Daniel. Margaret came with a smile too perfect to be sincere. She called me sweetheart, but only when my father was around. When he wasn't, I became Ethan, the stepchild, the burden. Daniel was born a year after they married. From the moment he arrived, it was like the family hit reset. Baby pictures everywhere. First steps recorded, first words celebrated. My milestones were barely acknowledged. I remember getting straight A's one semester, and my dad's response was a nod and a reminder that grades don't make a man, responsibility does. I learned early not to expect applause. By the time I was 17, I already knew I wouldn't be joining Carter Group. My father's construction empire, built from scratch by my grandfather Charles, had become his sole focus. He used to walk through the offices like he was conquering something. The staff called him Mr. Carter with a tone that blended fear and reverence. I tried once to show interest. At 18, I asked to intern during the summer. My father said yes, but I was placed in inventory, stacking files and labeling boxes. I didn't last a week. Instead, I left for California, studied architecture at UCLA, and poured everything into design. I didn't want to build buildings like my father. I wanted to create them, shape them with intention and soul. I never told him I graduated top of my class. He wouldn't have cared. Now I'm 31, working for a boutique firm in downtown Houston. It's not big. We don't make skyscrapers, but we've designed some of the most beautiful community centers and private homes in the city. I lead a small team. My name's on every blueprint we submit. It's not Carter Group, but it's mine. Last Friday, I checked my mail late after a long day. Among the bills and pre-approved credit offers, there was a thick envelope with gold-embossed letters. Daniel Carter and Isabel Turner cordially invite you to celebrate their union in marriage. The wedding would take place in Santa Barbara, California. Lavish resort, 3-day event, dress code formal. I hadn't spoken to Daniel in over a year. Our last conversation ended with him laughing at me during a family dinner after I'd suggested Carter Group invest in sustainable projects. He called it liberal fluff. But now I was invited. I turned the envelope over, checking if there was a personal note. Nothing. Just a typed address and RSVP link. I stared at it for a while. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because of what I felt when I held it. Not anger, not joy, just that same old echo from childhood. Like I'd been placed in the guest list of my own family. I set the invitation on the counter, took off my shoes, and walked into the kitchen. Poured a glass of water. The evening sunlight hit the window just right, casting golden streaks across the tile floor. It was quiet, peaceful. My place, my life, entirely built without their approval. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, not of resentment, but of curiosity. Why now? Why invite me? Was it for appearances? A photo op to show the whole Carter clan in harmony? I took another sip of water and looked back at the envelope. Maybe it was time I stopped being a shadow. Maybe it was time I showed up. The flight to Santa Barbara was uneventful, but my thoughts were anything but. I hadn't seen my father in over 2 years, maybe more. The last time was at Charles's birthday dinner, a formal affair at the country club. Robert Carter had shown up late, made a speech about legacy, and left before dessert. I remember offering him a ride home, and he declined without even looking at me. He always did that, looked through me. My earliest memories of my father were shaped not by warmth, but by expectation. He wasn't a man of affection. He measured love in achievement, worth in obedience. If you did things his way, you were efficient. If you questioned, you were emotional. And emotion was weakness. That's what he said to me once after I cried during a high school award speech. "You're too sensitive. Men don't lead with feelings." After Mom died, he changed. Or maybe he was always that way and just stopped pretending. Margaret filled the emotional vacuum, at least for Daniel. She had a way of turning every conversation into a compliment for her son. "Daniel is so smart. Daniel reminds me of your father. Daniel's already learning about the business." I was 13 when I realized she didn't like me. Not dislike, just disinterest. She never learned the name of my middle school. By the time I was in college, I stopped trying to make her remember. When I first expressed interest in joining Carter Group, I was a junior at UCLA. I sent a formal email, attached my resume, asked for a summer internship. No reply. A week later, a secretary emailed back saying they were full. The next year, I tried again. I got in, but was placed in records management, second floor, far from anything resembling actual design. I filed blueprints all day, labeled boxes, and fetched coffee for people who didn't know my last name. On my second week, someone from HR mistook me for a courier. The third time after graduation, I went directly to my father. I remember walking into his office, rehearsing my pitch in the hallway. I told him I wanted to work in the design division. I had plans for energy-efficient housing prototypes, cost-effective community centers. He sat behind his desk, arms crossed, and didn't say a word until I finished. Then he leaned back and asked me why I was wasting time on eco-fantasies. He said no one buys virtue, they buy value. When I tried to explain how sustainability was becoming a competitive edge, he waved me off. This company was built on steel, concrete, and profit. I didn't come back after that meeting. I flew back to LA the same evening and never applied again. Years later, I heard that Daniel had been brought in as director of business strategy at Carter Group. He didn't study architecture. He barely finished college. But he dressed the part. He talked like my father, and he played the game well. People at the company called him the heir. He loved that title. It was Daniel who once told me I was better off building benches for artists than buildings for executives. He thought it was a joke. I didn't laugh. I still remember the day I pitched the Green Housing Initiative. I created a presentation, laid out budgets, models, long-term returns. I had just won an award from a state design council and was riding high on the belief that maybe, just maybe, they'd see me differently. I emailed it to the boardroom, scheduled a meeting, and waited. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. My father didn't even show up. One of the executives, a friend of his, called the proposal idealistic nonsense. Someone else said it sounded feminine. That word stuck with me. As if empathy had a gender, as if building with purpose meant building like a woman, and that somehow made it less. That was the last time I tried. After that, I moved back to Houston, but stayed out of their world. I found a firm that valued vision over bloodlines. I worked quietly, took small wins as proof of my worth. I created spaces people actually lived in, places that held memories, not just profit margins. I built a life that didn't need their approval. My apartment in Montrose was modest but filled with light. I had a dog, a rescue mutt named Charlie. My friends were people who didn't know my last name came with a company attached to it. I stopped attending family functions. I didn't go to birthdays. I skipped Christmas dinners. And yet the wedding invitation had found its way to me. I stared at my reflection in the hotel mirror, now adjusting my tie. The rehearsal dinner was tonight. I wasn't here for redemption. I wasn't here to impress anyone. I was here because something in me refused to disappear quietly. I took a deep breath, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked out the door. The rehearsal dinner didn't start for another few hours, so I found myself pacing the guest suite at the resort, restless. It was the kind of place designed to impress, all soft lighting, open terraces, and overpriced wine. I wasn't in the mood to socialize, so I wandered to the bookcase in the corner of the room. It looked mostly decorative, filled with hardcovers no one ever read. But something about the quiet pulled me toward it. I ran my fingers along the spines and froze when I spotted a familiar name. A worn green binder tucked between two leather-bound novels. It was mine, or rather it used to be. The same one my mom used to keep in our house when I was little, filled with her sketches and clippings. I pulled it out slowly and opened the front cover. There was a faint scent of old paper and lavender, her favorite. Inside, pages of architectural drawings, hand-penciled notes, and magazine clippings. She had an eye for beauty, a sense of proportion that I only came to understand years later in school. I turned a few pages, stopped when I saw something I didn't remember. A letter folded neatly in half-aged yellow around the edges. My name was written on the front in her handwriting. It was unmistakable, sharp but flowing, elegant, like everything she did. I stood there for a long moment, heart lodged somewhere in my throat, then sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it. Ethan. If you're reading this, I'm probably no longer around to say these things to you the way I want to. I've watched you grow, and I know you carry a tenderness this world doesn't always value. Don't let them tell you it's a flaw. It's your gift. There will come a time when you're faced with a choice. Do the thing that feels right, even if your father doesn't see it, even if no one does. Build what you believe in. That's how you'll find your place. Love always, Mom. I read it twice, then again. Her words carried the same quiet power she had in life. She never raised her voice, but when she spoke, I listened. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest just for a second. It felt like she was in the room. I went back to the binder and started flipping through the pages again. There were more detailed sketches, early blueprints. I recognized the signature on some of them. Not hers, Charles Carter, my grandfather. He and my mother had worked on these together. One page caught my attention. An annotated floor plan of the very first Carter Group building. It was a modest office complex built in the early 90s. I knew the structure well. I had visited once as a child. But here in her handwriting were notes about the lobby layout, glass installation choices, natural lighting angles. My mother had been more than a hobbyist. She had been deeply involved. On the back of that sheet in faded pencil was a note from Charles. Thank you for helping me bring this to life. Your vision makes this feel less like a building and more like a legacy. I sat back stunned. My grandfather had relied on her. And yet I had never heard anyone in the family talk about her contributions. Not once. In all the Carter Group board announcements, press features, and anniversary tributes, she was never mentioned. It was like she never existed within that world. Why, I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the Pacific. The sun was dipping low, bleeding into the horizon. My father had always made it seem like Carter Group was his creation. His empire. He spoke of Charles like he inherited a kingdom and built it stronger. But if my mother had helped design the foundation, literally, what else had been left out? I thought back to that boardroom rejection years ago. How they dismissed my sustainable housing proposal as fluff. How someone had used the word feminine like a slur. If they had known my mother's ideas helped shape the company's beginning, would they have still used that tone, or was that the reason they erased her? I sat back down and opened my laptop. I typed her name into the Carter Group archives. Nothing. No mentions. I scrolled through old press releases. Nothing. It was as if her hands never touched a single piece of that legacy. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. Then I searched again. This time I typed in Charles Carter and scanned the oldest entries. One brief mention buried in an early local newspaper article from 1992. A design consultant listed by first name, only credited as an outside advisor on the first Carter project. Elizabeth Carter, my mother. I closed the laptop and looked at the letter again. She hadn't just asked me to follow my heart. She had left a trail, quiet, undeniable, like she knew one day I'd go looking, and now I had. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the hills when I made my way down to the outdoor terrace where the rehearsal dinner was being held. String lights hung over the long tables, flickering softly like stars trapped in branches. Everyone was dressed to match the venue's elegance. Suits, satin-polished shoes, practiced smiles. I stood near the entrance for a moment, scanning the crowd. Waitstaff moved swiftly with trays of champagne and canapes. Daniel was laughing at something, his hand resting on Isabel's back like he already owned the place. Margaret held court at the center table, her voice loud enough to announce her relevance. And my father Robert was in conversation with the resort manager, likely giving instructions instead of thanks. No one noticed me at first. When they did, it was with polite nods, the kind you offer distant relatives you don't really like. Daniel spotted me eventually and waved half-heartedly. I nodded back. I wasn't here to make peace, I was here to observe. I kept my distance, wandered toward the side garden where heat lamps buzzed and fewer people lingered. A low hedge bordered the stone pile, and beyond it a small sitting area wrapped around a fire pit. That's when I heard them. Robert's voice was low but firm, the kind of tone he used when he thought no one could challenge him. Daniel's was sharper, eager, filled with the confidence only the favored child could carry. They were standing just out of sight, backs to me, framed by the soft flicker of the fire. "He's 79, Daniel said. "He's tired. He should be." "He's stubborn," Robert replied. "But if we pressure him with the right language, tie it to your marriage, the future of the company, he'll see it's logical. He knows you're the face people expect." "And if he doesn't?" Daniel asked. "Then we make him an offer he can't refuse. We tie in the board, lean on the charter. We have the votes," Robert said. "You'll be majority by next quarter." The voices faded slightly as they walked further down the path. I stayed frozen, heart hammering. I knew my grandfather still held a significant stake in Carter Group. His silence in recent years wasn't apathy. He'd been watching, waiting. But Robert and Daniel were moving fast. They wanted to consolidate, which meant one thing. They wanted to push Charles out, take everything. And I had just found out how deeply my mother had been involved in its founding. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make noise, and slipped through the side hallway into the main building. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from clarity. I had been on the outside so long I almost forgot what it felt like to be close to something that mattered. Inside, the lobby was quiet. A pianist played softly in the corner, notes echoing like whispers. I pulled out my phone and called the front desk. "Hi." I said, "I'd like to speak with Mr. Charles Carter, please. He's a guest here. I'm his grandson." The receptionist paused. "I'm sorry, sir. Mr. Carter isn't accepting any calls or visitors this evening." "Can you leave him a message?" I asked. "It's important." "I can try," she said, voice hesitant. "What's the message?" "Tell him Ethan needs to speak with him. It's urgent. Family urgent." She agreed to pass it along, but I knew the answer before she even hung up. He wouldn't respond. Not tonight. I ended the call and stood there, phone still in hand. The chandelier above me sparkled like glass teeth. I needed help. Not just emotional support, someone who could dig, who knew how to read between corporate lines. I scrolled through my contacts and tapped Rachel's name. She picked up on the second ring. "Ethan," she said, a bit surprised. "It's been a minute." "Yeah, it has. Sorry for calling out of the blue," I said. "I need a favor. Actually, I need your brain. Sounds dangerous." "Where are you, Santa Barbara?" "At a wedding, my brother's." "Long story, but I overheard something tonight. My father and brother are trying to pressure my grandfather into giving up his shares in Carter Group. They're planning to take full control. That doesn't sound legal," she said. "Maybe not, but they're doing it quietly behind closed doors. I need to know if there's any protection for Charles in the company charter. Anything that might slow them down or make what they're doing harder." "I can pull the incorporation documents," she said, "and maybe old board meeting notes if they're filed anywhere public." "Give me a few hours, or do you want me to come up there?" "Not yet," I said. "Just find out what you can, especially if there's any record of early contributions." "From my mother." There was a pause. "Elizabeth, yeah, she had a role in the company's start. I think they buried it." "All right," she said. "I'll dig. Thanks, Rach." "Always," she said, then hung up. I slipped the phone back in my pocket and turned toward the ballroom. Laughter spilled through the open doors. My family was toasting themselves, celebrating alliances built on control. I wasn't part of the toast, but I wasn't just a guest anymore either. Morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long slivers of gold across the carpeted floor. I hadn't slept much. Rachel had sent over a few early documents around 2 a.m., including Carter Group's original incorporation form. My mother's name wasn't on it, but there were handwritten notes in the margins on the scanned copy. Initials, EC, same as hers. Nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest someone didn't want her contribution to be remembered. At 8:37 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text. "Room 11003. Now." No name, no signature. But I knew. I pulled on a fresh shirt, brushed my teeth, grabbed the binder with the letter still inside, and headed to the elevator. The hallway on the 11th floor was quiet, lined with thick beige carpet and polished sconces. I knocked once. The door opened slowly. Charles Carter stood in front of me, thinner than I remembered, but sharp-eyed as ever. His silver hair was combed back, his navy robe pressed his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said. I stepped inside. The suite was minimalist, tasteful. A pot of coffee steamed on the side table next to a folded copy of the Wall Street Journal. He motioned to a chair near the window, then sat across from me. "You finally decided to speak," he said, not as a question, but a statement. "I didn't think you'd listen," I replied. He gave a short nod. "That's fair. Most of the time I don't, but sometimes silence tells you more than words." I opened the binder on my lap, showed him the page with her handwriting, the blueprint from 1992. He didn't look surprised. "You remember this?" I asked. "Of course I do." She had a better sense of proportion than most licensed architects. And she cared about people, not just design. That's why I hired her. Off the record. Why off the record? Your father. He didn't want Elizabeth involved. Thought it blurred family and business. I disagreed. But Robert was louder. Always has been. "She helped build this," I said quietly. "All of it." Charles nodded again. "She did, and she never asked for credit. That's the kind of person she was. You have more of her in you than you know." I took a breath, tried to steady myself. "Last night I overheard Dad and Daniel. They're pushing you to sell your shares, planning to consolidate everything under Daniel. He poured coffee into 2 cups, handed one to me. I know, he said simply. You know, of course, Daniel thinks he's clever. Robert thinks he's still running the show. But neither of them know how to listen. They only know how to talk. Why haven't you stopped them? Because they haven't crossed the line yet, and because I needed to see what you would do. You were testing me in a way. I needed to know if you were ready to look at the whole picture, not just your pain. Legacy is about more than revenge. They're going to try to strip you out, I said. Legally or by force, they already have the board leaning their way. Charles smiled faintly. Let them try. I've had contingency plans in place for years, including one for this exact moment. What matters now is that you're here, and that you're paying attention. What are you going to do? Nothing. Not yet. What do you mean? I mean exactly that, he said, leaning forward. Tomorrow at the wedding, your father will say something small but deliberate. Watch how people react. Watch how Daniel handles himself in the spotlight. Then we'll decide. He nodded. I've built this company twice, once with brick and steel, once with lawyers and loopholes, but I won't build it a third time. I need someone who can lead it into something better. Not bigger, better. I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. The weight of what he was saying sat heavy on my chest. So what do you want me to do? Don't do anything. Not yet, he said again. Just observe. Watch everything, every word, every silence. Don't interrupt, don't defend yourself. Not tomorrow. And after that, we'll talk again. He stood and walked over to the window, staring out at the ocean. You know, your mother once told me you saw the world differently. I thought she meant you were naive. Turns out she was right. You do see it differently. And that may be exactly what we need. I left the room with the binder pressed to my chest, mind racing. Tomorrow wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was the beginning of something I hadn't seen coming. The morning air carried a strange stillness, the kind that presses on your chest before something breaks. I got dressed slowly, slipping into the only tailored suit I owned. Navy simple, understated. I'd worn it to award ceremonies, client pitches, funerals. Today it was for my brother's wedding. The ceremony was set in the vineyard behind the resort. Rows of white chairs faced an arch wrapped in florals and silk, all perfectly symmetrical, all curated to impress. Guests filled the space in slow waves, dressed in pastels and champagne tones, taking their assigned seats with murmured greetings. My name card was placed at table 12, back corner, next to a couple of Daniel's former fraternity brothers and a second cousin I hadn't seen in a decade. From where I sat, I couldn't even see the wedding arch without leaning sideways. Everyone at the front had last names that mattered or connections that profited. My last name, it seemed, only counted when used selectively. Margaret walked past me with a flurry of perfume and pearls, pretending not to notice. Robert stood near the front, greeting guests with the poise of a politician. He shook hands, laughed on cue, touched shoulders like he was offering blessings. I stayed seated. The ceremony began precisely at noon. Isabel walked down the aisle in lace and grace. Daniel stood like a man already crowned. The vows were standard, the kiss rehearsed. People clapped politely, some even cried. I watched it all like a scene in a film I wasn't cast in. Afterward, we were ushered to the reception tent. Chandeliers floated above the tables. The head table was a long, elevated platform dressed in gold and white. Daniel and Isabel sat in the middle with Robert and Margaret on one side, her parents on the other. I didn't expect a seat up there, but I did notice the empty chair next to Margaret, a small name card tucked underneath a folded napkin. Rachel arrived just after the first course was served. She wore a muted green dress and sunglasses that hid half her expression. "You all right?" she asked, sliding into the chair beside me. "Peachy," I said, sipping water. She glanced toward the head table. They always this subtle, painfully. She leaned in slightly. "You still want me to record?" I nodded. She tapped her phone and set it against her clutch on the table. The microphone on that thing could catch whispers from across a stadium. Today it would catch something much more important. The toasts began after dessert. The best man, then Isabel's father. Soft applause followed each. Then Robert stood. He didn't raise his glass right away. Instead, he placed both hands on the table and looked at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today. It means a great deal to our family. Watching Daniel grow into the man he is today has been one of the greatest joys of my life. And now seeing him take this next step with Isabel, I couldn't be more proud." He paused, letting the words settle. I knew what was coming. Not the details, but the shape of it. Charles had warned me. "Observe," he had said, "don't react. As many of you know, Daniel has played a critical role in modernizing our family business. His vision, his leadership, his discipline. He's ready to take on more, much more." He smiled at his son, then turned toward the crowd again. And of course, none of this would be possible without the people behind the scenes. Every great man has a team. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone who's been a loyal supporter throughout. Someone who's always played their part without asking for attention. Someone who has worked quietly like a true professional. I felt the shift in the room before he said it. Heads turned slightly. Eyes landed on me. "My son, Ethan," Robert said with measured precision, "has been a dedicated employee. His assistance on select projects has been appreciated. Quiet, reliable, disciplined, like the kind of team member every organization needs." There it was. Dignified dismissal, gift-wrapped as praise. People clapped, confused. A few looked toward me with sympathy, a few with curiosity. Daniel didn't look at me at all. Margaret raised her glass and smiled proud like a general whose strategy had worked. Rachel's phone was still recording. I glanced at her. She didn't say a word. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just lifted my glass, slightly smiled faintly, and took a sip of water. They wanted to define my place, not at the head table, not at the center, just close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. But I saw everything. And so did Charles. The applause for Robert's toast had barely faded when the servers began wheeling out the multi-tiered cake. The music softened and photographers circled like hawks looking for the perfect angle. Guests shifted in their chairs, ready to capture the next Instagrammable moment. I stayed seated, the corners of my mouth still curled in that same neutral smile. Then I saw Charles rise. He moved slowly but deliberately, pushing his chair back with a steadiness that demanded attention. He stood at the far end of the head table, no microphone in hand, no notes, just the presence of a man who had spent his life commanding rooms. The low hum of chatter faded until all that remained was silence and the faint chime of glassware being set down. "Thank you," he began, his voice surprisingly clear for a man nearing 80. "I want to say a few words before this beautiful celebration continues." He turned toward Daniel and Isabel, offering a polite nod. "Weddings are about new beginnings, and not just for the couple, but for the families that surround them, for the legacies that continue through them. Today is one such moment." Robert leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing. "I've spent the last few years considering what legacy truly means, what it requires, who carries it forward. And I've come to realize it's not about inheritance or bloodline. It's about vision, integrity, and the courage to act when no one else will." He looked directly at me. "Effective immediately, I am transferring my full executive authority and ownership stake in Carter Group to Ethan Carter." There was a sound, soft and sharp, like air being sucked from the room. "He is now the lawful CEO of the company." Charles continued. As of this morning, the documents were signed, witnessed, and filed. The transition is complete. Gasps followed, scattered but audible. Margaret's wine glass trembled. Daniel stared, unmoving, color draining from his face. Robert gripped the table edge so tightly his knuckles whitened. To ensure transparency, I've asked our corporate counsel to confirm the details. A woman in a gray suit stood up at the far end of the room. Mid-30s, composed briefcase in hand. She opened it, removed a folder, and walked to the head table. "My name is Sophia Nguyen," she said calmly. "I represent Carter Group's legal affairs. Mr. Charles Carter executed the necessary paperwork this morning at 9:03 a.m. with 2 independent witnesses and notarization. All documents have been submitted to the state of California. As of now, Mr. Ethan Carter is the CEO and principal shareholder of Carter Group." She handed the folder to Robert. He didn't take it. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was seismic, like a building preparing to crack. I remained still. I didn't stand. I didn't speak. I let it settle. Let every guest turn and look at me like they were trying to recall if they had spoken to me earlier. Let Robert stew in his own quiet rage. Let Daniel sit frozen beside a cake that suddenly didn't matter. Inside, I wasn't calm. I was chaos wrapped in discipline. My heart pounded, my throat felt tight, but I held the expression I'd perfected over the years. The one that said nothing. The one they never bothered to learn how to read. Rachel leaned closer and whispered quietly enough for only me to hear. Well, that was something. Robert was the first to move. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. Without a word, he walked out of the tent, the flap swinging wildly behind him. Margaret followed seconds later, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, muttering something incoherent. Daniel just sat there, stunned, his fork still in his hand. I slipped away quietly. No one tried to stop me. Out on the balcony, the evening air was cooler than expected. I found a quiet corner overlooking the vineyard and poured myself a glass of whiskey from the self-serve bar. The burn in my throat helped settle the tremor in my chest. Footsteps approached. Rachel again. She didn't speak immediately, just leaned against the railing beside me. "You know this is going to be everywhere, right?" she said. "Let it be," I replied. "I have the full clip. You should post it. Frame your story, control the narrative." I took a sip, watching the golden light fade across the hills. Justice that arrives on time doesn't need to go viral. She smiled slightly, but didn't push further. The next morning, Carter Group's emergency board meeting was called. The company's senior executives, board members, and council gathered in the glass conference room of the downtown Los Angeles office. Robert arrived first, jaw set, eyes dark. Sophia and I walked in together. The room quieted. Robert stood. "I call into question the legitimacy of the share transfer. I demand an immediate review of the succession documents." Sophia didn't flinch. She opened a binder and distributed copies of the certified legal transfer. "Mr. Carter," she said, "your father followed every protocol outlined in the company's bylaws. The witnesses were present. The filing is on record with the Secretary of State. Your motion is invalid." He turned to the board. "You can't just hand over an empire to someone who's never run a division." One of the board members raised a brow. "Is that different from how you started, Robert?" Silence. I didn't speak during the meeting. I didn't need to. The paper in front of each director said more than I ever could. By the end, it was clear. They could question. They could rage, but they couldn't reverse it. 3 weeks later, I walked into Carter Group's headquarters, not as a visitor, not as a consultant, but as CEO. The reception area looked the same, but every eye that landed on me carried new weight. I nodded politely, offering short greetings, and rode the elevator to the top floor in silence. My new office had Robert's fingerprints all over it. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, outdated artwork. It smelled like the past. I made a mental note to redesign it. By midday, the whispers had started. Some greeted me formally. Others avoided eye contact. One executive, Benjamin Price, a longtime ally of Robert's, barely hid his sneer when he passed my office. By Thursday, the rumors intensified. Emails questioning the legitimacy of the transition. hints that I would be a figurehead, nothing more. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I dove into the current projects, reviewed department reports, and initiated a review of company expenditures. I began assembling a transition strategy focused on transparency, innovation, and restructuring outdated branches. Friday morning, Benjamin burst into the executive lounge, mid-breakfast, voice raised. This company is not some sandbox experiment for a legacy handoff. We need real leadership. I didn't respond to him directly. I turned to the others in the room. We'll be having an open meeting Monday afternoon. All department heads, every employee who wishes to attend is welcome. I want questions, concerns, no pre-screening, total transparency. Benjamin scoffed. You'll lose control. Then I guess I'll find out who was holding it in the first place. That Monday, the main conference room filled to capacity. People stood along the walls, some with crossed arms, others holding notepads. I walked in with Sophia and Rachel by my side. We talked for 90 minutes. I didn't lecture. I listened. I answered questions with honesty. I acknowledged my inexperience in running a corporation of this size and paired it with a vision of where we could go together. By the end, most stayed behind to shake my hand. It wasn't unanimous trust, but it was a start. The office lights had dimmed, the buzz of conversation replaced by slints. As I gathered my notes to leave, my assistant knocked lightly on the open door. Your brother's here. Says he'd like a word. Alone. Daniel stood just outside the threshold, shoulders squared but eyes cautious. I nodded, waving off my assistant. Come in. He stepped inside slowly, like someone entering a room they weren't sure they had permission to be in. We stood for a second before I gestured toward the 2 chairs by the window. He didn't sit. Do you ever wonder how it got like this? He asked. Every day. He exhaled, then finally took the seat opposite me. The sunset cast a warm glow across his face, softening the lines that hadn't been there a year ago. Were you ever jealous of me? He asked suddenly. I paused. No, I was never jealous. I just wanted respect, not more, not even equal. Just enough to not feel invisible. Daniel leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands. Dad made it clear you'd never be part of the core. I didn't fight him. And I need to tell you something. His voice dropped. Years ago, you applied for that project lead role. The one in San Diego. Yeah, I remember. You never even got a response. Because I never sent your application forward. Dad asked me to screen them, and when I saw your name, he said to delete it. I sat still. No rage, no shock. Just a quiet confirmation of something I'd suspected all along. Why are you telling me this now? Because I thought we were just doing what was best for the company, for the family. But standing up there that night, watching Grandpa hand it all to you, I realized I didn't earn any of it. I was handed roles, titles, but you were the one doing the work, from the outside. Always from the outside. Silence settled again, heavy but not cruel. I'm not going to retaliate, I said. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm not offering any. I'm offering clarity. I'm going to lead this company because it deserves better. Because Mom deserved better. She was a foundational part of this company, and you know what she got? Forgotten. I'm not going to let that happen again. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. He stood up, walked to the door, and paused. Good luck, Ethan. Thanks. When the door clicked shut behind him, I turned back to the window. The city below moved on, unaware of the conversations that could change entire futures. I poured myself a glass of water and stared at the framed photograph of my mother on the shelf. We're not done yet, Mom, but we're getting closer. The next morning, Sophia stepped into my office with a large envelope in her hand. Found this in your grandfather's personal archive. He said your mother left it there years ago. Figured it should come to you now. She placed it gently on my desk and left without another word. I sat down slowly, sliding a letter opener beneath the seal. Inside were 2 pages. One handwritten in the flowing script I recognized instantly. The other typed on Carter Group letterhead with Charles's signature at the bottom. I opened hers first. Ethan, if you're reading this, I guess something finally changed. I hope you're older now. I hope the world has treated you kindly even when people didn't. There's something I never told you. I helped design the very first Carter Group office. Not just the layout. I built the vision with Charles from the ground up. We were just two dreamers with big ideas and borrowed time. But when your father came into the picture, he saw me as ornamental. I was young, creative, and female. To him, that meant disposable. He erased my name from the records, told the board it had all been his and Charles's doing. I never fought him. I thought staying quiet would protect you. I was wrong. If you're holding this letter, maybe now is the time for you to speak. Loudly, clearly, with your work, with your name. Love always, Mom. I sat there for minutes, maybe longer, reading it again, letting each word settle into the silence of the room. Then I unfolded the second page. Charles's note was brief. Ethan, she was the first one who believed in this company before it had a name. I let her be sidelined. I let my son push her out. That was my greatest failure. I owe your mother more than an apology. I owe her legacy, and now I pay it. Charles, I looked out the window at the same skyline I'd grown up beneath. The one my mother helped build. She hadn't left me just memories, she left me a foundation. Weeks later, the clip from the wedding speech went viral. Not through Rachel, not through me, but from some unknown guest who had posted it to a small family blog. It caught fire. People shared it, dissected it, quoted it. The part where my father called me a loyal employee. The part where Charles made me CEO. And the part where I didn't flinch. Messages flooded in. People who said they'd felt overlooked too. People who saw their own family fractures in my silence. People who told me it gave them hope. I didn't respond to most. I didn't need to. This wasn't about revenge. It never was. This was about being seen. About honoring what had been forgotten. About leading from a place that wasn't built on ego or inheritance, but on merit, on integrity, on truth. In the quiet of my office, I leaned back in the chair that once belonged to my grandfather. The chair my mother helped choose. The view was the same, but everything had changed. I once believed I was just an employee in my father's eyes, a shadow in the family name. Now I know better. I am the CEO, not to prove anything to them, but to build what comes next. If you've ever been the forgotten one in your own family, remember this. Maybe you're not invisible. Maybe you're just the legacy waiting for the right moment to rise.